History remembers Napoleon. It remembers the battles, the empire, the exile, the 100 days. It remembers the hat, the hand tucked into the coat, the silhouette that became a symbol. It does not remember the man who kept the empire running while Napoleon was in the field. The man who built the legal foundation that still underpins the law of dozens of nations today. The man who survived the revolution, the terror, the consulate, the empire, and the restoration, without ever once becoming the main character, and without ever once losing his grip on real power. His name was Cambacérès, and he may have been the most consequential legal mind in the history of the modern world. 1. Origins. A mind forged in the law Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès was born in 1753 in Montpellier, into a family that occupied a precise and telling position in French society, the haute bourgeoisie of the legal profession. Not nobility by blood, but what the French called noblesse de robe, the nobility of the robe, earned through generations of service in courts, parliaments, and administrative chambers, rather than through the accident of birth. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear. The noblesse de robe existed in the uncomfortable space between the aristocracy above them and the common people below, close enough to power to understand how it functioned, but never fully trusted by those who held it by birthright. It was a position that demanded a particular kind of intelligence, not the bold, aggressive confidence of inherited privilege, but the patient, analytical, almost invisible competence of the indispensable technician. Cambacérès absorbed that ethos completely. His childhood was spent in an environment where law was not merely a profession, but a way of perceiving reality. A belief that the chaotic, contradictory, passionately irrational surface of human affairs could, with sufficient rigor and precision, be reduced to clear principles, workable definitions, and coherent systems. Where other children learn to navigate the world through charm or physical confidence or social grace, the young Cambacérès learned to navigate it through analysis. He was, by most contemporary accounts, physically unimposing and socially reserved, not awkward but deliberately contained, as if he was permanently conserving energy for the mental work he found more interesting than any social performance. By the time the revolution arrived, he was already an established and respected lawyer in Montpellier, with a reputation for the quality that would define his entire career: the ability to take a situation of extreme complexity and disorder and reduce it, calmly and methodically, to its essential legal structure. While others saw chaos, Cambacérès saw problems waiting for the right framework. He was about to get more problems than any one lawyer could reasonably expect. 2. Surviving the unsurvivable. The French Revolution killed people with remarkable efficiency and almost complete disregard for their previous political positions. Aristocrats died for being aristocrats. Moderates died for being insufficiently radical. Radicals died for being insufficiently radical enough. The terror consumed its own architects with such thoroughness that the guillotine became less a tool of political justice than a kind of self-correcting mechanism for a system that had lost all internal coherence. Cambacérès survived it all. This was not luck. It was, in its own way, a form of genius, a different application of the same analytical mind that made him a brilliant lawyer. He understood, earlier and more clearly than most of his contemporaries, that the revolution was not a destination, but a process, a series of convulsions that would continue until the underlying political and social forces reached some new equilibrium. The smart move was not to become the face of any particular phase of that process, because every face eventually became a target. He sat in the National Convention during the most dangerous years of the Revolution. He voted for the execution of Louis XVI, a choice that aligned him with the radical mainstream of the moment and protected him from accusations of royalist sympathy. But he made that vote quietly, without rhetoric, without the theatrical outrage that distinguished the true believers from the technicians. He was not Robespierre, intoxicated by ideology and the righteousness of total transformation. He was not a Girondin, attached to moderate principles that became a death sentence when the political wind shifted. He was, deliberately and consistently, a technician of power, someone whose value to any regime lay not in what he believed, but in what he could do. And what he could do, no one else could do quite as well. The insight beneath the survival strategy runs deeper than mere opportunism. Cambacérès understood that political systems, however violent their surface, always eventually require administration, that someone has to make the laws work, manage the bureaucracy, keep the financial machinery functioning, translate the grand ideological visions of the people at the top into actual workable governance. That person is, by definition, useful to whoever is in charge, regardless of who that happens to be at any given moment. Usefulness, cultivated carefully enough, is more durable than ideology. He was never the most powerful man in the room. He was always the most necessary one. And in the long run, necessary outlasts powerful. The second consul, running an empire from the background. When Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799 and reorganized the French government around the structure of the Consulate, he made a choice that revealed his own political intelligence. He made Cambacérès second consul. On the surface, this looked like a subordinate position. Napoleon was first consul, the undisputed center of gravity. But Napoleon was also, almost constantly, somewhere else, fighting in Italy, campaigning in Austria, reorganizing Egypt, planning the invasion of England. The French Empire was not governed from the battlefield, and Napoleon knew it. He needed someone at the center who could be trusted not with loyalty in the simple emotional sense. Napoleon had plenty of people who were loyal to him emotionally, and most of them were useless, but with competence, discretion, and the ability to handle every political, legal, and administrative crisis that arose without requiring Napoleon's personal attention. Cambacérès was that person for more than a decade. He chaired the Council of State. He managed the complex, constantly shifting relationships between the competing factions of the French political class, the former revolutionaries, the returned émigrés, the new imperial nobility, the old professional classes, with a patience and tactical skill that Napoleon, who preferred to resolve disagreements by overwhelming force, could never have deployed himself. He maintained the financial systems that kept the empire solvent. He navigated the relationship with the church following the Concordat of 1801. He handled, in short, everything that required subtlety rather than force. Napoleon's relationship with him was fascinating precisely because it broke his normal pattern. Napoleon didn't like being advised. He surrounded himself with subordinates who executed his decisions rather than questioned them, and he had a well-documented tendency to destroy men who challenged his judgment. With Cambacérès, he listened, not always, not on everything, but consistently enough that contemporaries noticed. The reason wasn't affection. It was something Napoleon respected more than affection. Cambacérès was right more often than he was wrong, and on the specific terrain of law and administration, Napoleon knew he was outmatched. This was the nature of Cambacérès' power, not charisma, not fear, not the intoxicating aura of the battlefield, simply the power of being the person with the solution when everyone else had run out of ideas. 3. The Civil Code, a monument built to last. If Cambacérès had done nothing else in his life but oversee the creation of the Napoleonic Code, the Code Civil, that alone would have secured him a place among the most consequential figures in the history of Western civilization. That it tends to be remembered as Napoleon's Code, rather than his, is entirely appropriate to the man's character, and entirely misleading about the actual history. To understand what the code represented, you need to understand what France looked like before it. Pre-revolutionary France was a legal nightmare of accumulated contradictions. The North operated primarily under customary law, hundreds of local variants, rooted in Germanic tradition, that differed significantly from region to region and had never been systematically codified. The South operated primarily under Roman law, in a different tradition entirely. Overlaid on both were the specific privileges and exemptions of the church, the nobility, the various corporate bodies and guilds and regional parliaments that had accumulated legal protections over centuries. The Revolution had abolished many of these structures in principle, but replaced them with nothing coherent, a series of legislative decrees that often contradicted each other, applied inconsistently, and left the fundamental question of what law actually governed France in any particular situation genuinely unclear. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a structural obstacle to the kind of unified, stable nation-state that both Napoleon's political ambitions and France's economic development required. You cannot have a modern commercial economy without predictable contract law. You cannot have a unified nation without a common legal framework that applies equally to all citizens. You cannot consolidate a revolution without translating its principles into enforceable rules. Cambacérès had understood this years before Napoleon appeared on the scene. As early as 1793, he had presented a draft civil code to the convention, a comprehensive attempt to synthesize the legal inheritance of both northern and southern France into a single coherent system. It was rejected as too abstract, too intellectual, too remote from the urgent political crises consuming the convention's attention at that moment. He drafted a second version in 1796. Also rejected. A third version in 1799. The coup intervened before it could be properly considered. By the time Napoleon came to power, Cambacérès had spent 6 years thinking about this problem from every angle. He had drafted and revised and rethought the fundamental architecture of what a unified French legal system should look like. When Napoleon gave him the authority and the resources to finally complete the work, Cambacérès was not starting from scratch. He was, at last, executing a vision he had been refining for nearly a decade. The genius of what emerged was not merely technical, though the technical achievement was extraordinary. The Code Civil synthesized Roman law and customary law into a system that was at once flexible enough to handle the infinite variety of human transactions and precise enough to be consistently applied. But more importantly, it translated the core political achievements of the Revolution: equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privilege, the secularization of civil life, the protection of property rights, into legal language that could survive changes of regime. The Revolution's most durable legacy wasn't the Republic, which came and went. It was the Code, which remained. Cambacérès understood something that was both legally sophisticated and politically profound. The best way to make a revolutionary transformation permanent is to encode it in law so precisely and practically that reversing it becomes functionally impossible. You don't protect equality by writing it into a constitution that the next government can rewrite. You protect it by making it the foundation on which every contract, every property transaction, every family arrangement in the country legally rests. Pull it out, and the entire structure collapses. That's not a political principle anymore. It's an engineering constraint. The code was adopted in 1804. Within years, it had been exported, voluntarily or through conquest, to the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and large parts of Germany and Latin America. Louisiana still operates under a legal tradition derived from it. Quebec's civil law bears its imprint. The legal systems of dozens of contemporary nations carry, embedded in their foundations, the architectural decisions that Cambacérès spent 6 years refining in draft after rejected draft during the bloodiest decade in French history. Napoleon put his name on it. History largely accepted that framing. Cambacérès, one suspects, would have considered this an entirely acceptable arrangement. 5. After Napoleon, the final proof. The truest test of Cambacérès' method came after Napoleon's fall, when the empire collapsed in 1814 and the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII. Cambacérès, who had served the empire as Arch-Chancellor and been granted the title of Duke of Parma, faced the same situation he had faced during the Terror 2 decades earlier. A regime change that was destroying the careers, and in some cases the lives, of those too closely associated with the previous order. He withdrew temporarily, went through the formal processes of reconciliation with the new regime, and then, with a patience that by this point was simply characteristic, waited. By 1815, he was back in Paris. By the July monarchy of the 1830s, he was once again a figure of consequence. He died in 1824, at the age of 70, having outlasted the Ancien Régime, the Revolution, the Terror, the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, and the First Restoration. He had held real power under every significant French government for more than 30 years. He left behind a legal monument that reshaped the laws of much of the world. He never once became the main character.